Hello everybody, my name is Dan Thompson. This is my MBA video for leadership change. Today's date is actually Sunday, March 20th, 2016. I just got back from Florida. Spent a week in Florida, that's why you haven't heard from me this week. So I'm going to get caught up with my post as soon as I'm done with this. I did do a PowerPoint to prepare for this video. The video I chose is called One Man. It's an unauthorized story of Nelson Mandela. And this is the person I chose to talk about as a leadership change agent. This video is approximately 52 minutes long. This movie is actually a documentary of Nelson and how he got his name and how he brought change to a country. The editor who actually wrote, the writer of this documentary, her name is Margaret Drane, D-R-A-N-E. Now, the movie is a documentary about a man who was born in South Africa, Nelson Mandela. His father was a tribal leader. Nelson was born July 18th of 1918. His given birth name was pulling the branch of a tree, or troublemaker. His last name was Mandela. He was born into a nation that was at its infancy of apartheid. When Mandela turned 9, he went to a Methodist school where he's given the name of Nelson, which took. From that day on, Nelson used that name in answer to it. Apartheid, or racism, was very strong in South Africa. But in actuality, apartheid did not become law until 1944. The movie about Nelson basically tells the story of how a prisoner became a leader of a nation. How a prisoner who took a nation that was breathed racism and used all his resources available to him and the power of his character to change that nation from a nation of racism to a nation of democracy. Nelson, when he was born, even though he was the son of a tribal leader, had less rights than a child who was white in color. The documentary movie is about how one man, by his leadership and persistence, defeated apartheid. The three main characters in the documentary were Nelson Mandela, his second wife Winnie, and the Afrikaner regime. The Afrikaner regime was the deliverers of injustice, and Winnie and Nelson had different ways of dealing with the injustice. And I'll get into that a little bit into this narration. As I've been speaking, the crisis that was going on in South Africa was apartheid. The Free Dictionary defines apartheid as an official policy of racial segregation formerly practiced in the Republic of South Africa involving political, legal, and economic discrimination against non-whites. There's two other definitions of apartheid from the Free Dictionary. The second one is a policy or practice of separating or segregating groups. The third one is the condition of being separated from others, segregation. This crisis goes back to the early 1600s when Dutch settlers colonized South Africa, calling themselves Afrikaners. Afrikaners thought the native African people were an inferior race. People of color were treated like cattle and were considered easy labor. For example, white children could walk freely, and what the Afrikaners would do is they'd hire people of color to police other people of color. Well, when people of color would walk through the same area that a white child would walk through, they'd have to show paperwork, almost like a passport, even though they lived in that country, to walk from one location to another location. Despite this, Mandela continued his studies. Well, let me rephrase that. This troubled Mandela as he was growing up, and he did not like how he was living and how the world was that he was living in. So he made it a point to get education. He continued studies all the way through grade school and high school until he earned his liberal arts degree in the 1940s. To avoid arranged marriages, Mandela and his good friend Oliver Tambo moved to Johannesburg, South Africa. This is where I believe Mandela met his crucible, one of his crucibles. In Johannesburg, he became police officer in the mines, and he saw such injustice between races that he couldn't stand it. It affected Mandela to the point that he knew he had to do something. He continued his education and obtained a law degree. At the same time, around 1944, apartheid grew from individuals being racist to actually racism became the law. Think about that. It was legal to be a racist. It was legal to treat people like cattle. But if we go back to history, we can go all the way back to Moses' days when he freed the Israelites that were slaves for 400 years. This is nothing new to the human race. It's a sad fact of life. In the 1940s, protests were starting to occur. People of color were protesting, and African regime were using force to reduce the protesting, either reduce it or terminate it. People of color did not have voting rights. 10% of the white population did not support apartheid. In 1944, Mandela joined the African National Congress to organize and work to fight apartheid. By 1948, Mandela had a daughter, and she died. This was another crucible that Mandela faced. These crucibles, the one where he was a police officer in the mines, his father dying, or his daughter dying, these incidents furthered Mandela's drive to right what he believed were wrongs, and he and his partner started the first black law firm in South Africa. Mandela divorced his first wife and remarried Winnie Mandela, who in her own right was a leader, but she took a different path of leadership, which I'll explain. Winnie Mandela was the first black social worker in South Africa. In 1956, the African regime fired 705 rounds into a mass of black protesters and killed 69 people. 10 were children, 180 were wounded, 50 of them were children, and most of the killed and wounded were shot in the back. This final crucible was the straw that caused Mandela to start a military wing to fight against the government. This military wing was called Spear of the Nation. Nelson did not believe in violence. He did not think blacks were superior than whites, or whites were superior than blacks, or one color superior than another color. He thought every human being were equal. But his convictions for equality were so strong that it drove him. He tried to do peaceful negotiations. He tried to do legal protests. And none of this was working. He joined the African National Congress, which was a group to fight apartheid, to fight racism. And the cause was so strong to him that he felt that he needed to get training and provide training to people in his group to fight what he thought was an injustice. And what he was doing is, in the beginning, he was actually blowing up buildings or infrastructure, post offices and other areas that were supporting apartheid. Bombs and incendiary devices. Mandela's organization, or I should say Mandela's organization, used against post offices, like I said, and other infrastructures that were used by Afrikaners and Afrikaner sympathizers. While this was occurring, Nelson ensured that the public knew this was not against white people. It was against a racist and injustice regime. I had a conversation with a coworker about my video debut, and my coworker asked me why I was doing a leadership video about a terrorist. And that was a good question that my coworker presented to me, because I come from a national security background. I work at Intelligence Fusion Center now with the Milwaukee Police Department. 2 days ago was my 25th anniversary with the Milwaukee Police Department. And in this conversation with my coworker, well, let me backtrack. What I'm getting at is, we have a saying at work is, one person's view of a terrorist can be another person's view of a freedom fighter. And my discussion I had with my coworker, I brought this up to him. I said, well, let's look at the United States. Great Britain, back in the 1700s, late 1700s, would consider us as terrorists. Boston Tea Party is a great example. Us ambushing supply routes, us ambushing soldiers. Were we terrorists, or were we freedom fighters? I can tell you this, the freedom rights that I have today would not be here if our ancestors back in the 1700s didn't do what they did to make our country the way it is now today. So my question to you, and I'll ask this again later, is, was Nelson Mandela a terrorist? And what are your thoughts about it? I then asked my coworker how our nation was found, and his answer was, fair enough. Then we ended up moving on and talking about police work. The African regime strengthened the resolve and carried out a strict apartheid rules to fight Mandela's, what they considered Mandela's terrorism attacks. In 1962, Mandela was in prison for sabotage and was in prison for 27 years. That's 2 years longer than what I did in the police department. It just amazes me to think about that. And during those 27 years, and I'm getting sidetracked, but during those 27 years, Mandela always had a positive attitude. Or I should say displayed a positive attitude. That's a better way to put it. He always displayed a positive attitude. Since Mandela was both a political prisoner and also a black, the Afrikaner's terminology, he received the least amount of rations in prison and was treated very poorly. He led by examples, always stood up straight, and this is by words of witnesses that were in prison with him. He stood up straight and proud and worked hard to show that he was not defeated, that he was his own leader. Every 6 months he was allowed a visitor, and he and his wife and Bishop Tutu would visit him. In prison, he preached nonviolence. Mandela preached that violence was not the answer. Even in prison, Mandela showed that he was an authentic leader. Again, we can go back to Mandela blowing up structures. He did not want to harm people, but he wanted to send a message, and he wanted to damage infrastructure belonging to injustice, even though he did not believe in violence. And, well, I'll continue. And I'm going to go on to say this. Nelson detested violence or one race trying to hurt another race. I was reading this book, and I'm going back to Mandela being a authentic leader, by Bill George, called True North. In the beginning of the book, George talked about hundreds of interviews he has done of successful leaders, and each one had a crucible story, which was some crisis in one's life that helped define one's character. In order to be an authentic leader, one must have strong values, and one must draw from life's experiences. So part of the authentic leadership theory is life crucibles. Whether the conflict or crisis is professional or personal, that can define the future success or failure of a leader. Warren Bennett stated, "The crucible is an essential element in the process of becoming a leader." Authentic leadership is a process. The most dominant trait of authentic leadership is the adherence to one's values. Bennett also stated that managers do things right, leaders do the right thing. Nelson Mandela always adhered to his value of fighting injustice and trying to create equality. And he never wavered from his moral character with that belief. In prison, Mandela never lost sight of his values, and he drew from his life experiences to visibly display that powerful inner strength. He also never lost sight of his vision and his faith. Mandela stated in an interview while in prison, "I fought against white domination, I fought against black domination, and I cherish the dream of a democratic society for all people. That is an ideal that I am prepared to die for." Even in prison, Mandela was winning the hearts and minds of the people of South Africa and the world. Mandela built up a network into a team who worked collaboratively to fight apartheid. One of Mandela's great spokespersons was his good friend Oliver Tambo. By 1988, the world was putting pressure on the South African government. Cabinet officials from President of South Africa would meet with Mandela and ask for cooperation. Mandela replied, "Only a free man can negotiate. Prisoners cannot enter into a contract." By 1990, President de Klerk began negotiations with the African National Congress that Mandela led from prison. In 1991, Mandela was released from prison. In 1993, Mandela led the African National Congress and did numerous speeches to stop warring between the American National Congress sympathizers and the Black Afrikaners sympathizers. By using the American National Congress, or the African National Congress, he built up a team. He's always smiled, he's always charismatic, and he never wavered from his moral character. In Nelson's speeches, Mandela preached a good head and a good heart are always a formidable combination. Nelson further stated, "We must use time wisely and forever realize that the time is always ripe to do right." These words inspired all of the people to become one, to be united, to work collaboratively, to create one nation without racism. Mandela did this through persistent, passionate patience and a determined will. His compassionate heart displayed compelling leadership. Mandela did not stand for any type of racism and would speak out against it, even if it was black on black or white on white. Furthermore, Mandela always was a patient before speaking. He was an expert in emotional intelligence. He's always self-aware of his moods. He self-regulated his responses. He'd be patient before speaking. He would listen, and after a pause, he'd respond with deliberate and powerful words. His power was he used the truth. Because of Mandela's persistent leadership, apartheid was abolished. De Klerk and Mandela were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and on that day, in display of great leadership, and towards the end of the movie, you'll see this. It's pretty moving. You see de Klerk, and you see Mandela walking towards each other. De Klerk has his head down a little bit. Mandela got his arms going in pride. He actually grabs de Klerk's hand and he lifts it up. And both their hands are together, a brown hand and a white hand together. And Mandela shakes that hand, showing that unity, showing that deliberate action of uniting two races together to be one nation. In 1994, Mandela became the first president of color in South Africa. Wrapping it up, one trait that benefited Mandela: even while he was in prison, he always surrounded himself with individuals who could carry on to complete the task of fighting against apartheid. One of Mandela's colleagues, Ramaphosa, in this film stated, Mandela's job was to set the course, not steer the ship. Mandela never wavered from his morals and beliefs and was willing to die for them if necessary. Instead, he served 27 years in prison because he would not waver from his character and his morals. Mandela exemplified his passionate compassion for others and demanded equal rights for all. Mandela's personality, his charismatic smile, no matter what was occurring, his smile was contagious. His smile, in and of itself, acted as a change agent. Mandela's character and determination changed policy in South Africa, and his leadership impacted the globe. One man. And all it takes is one. All of us can make a difference to do something. And it has a ripple effect. Another strength was that Mandela knew his weaknesses. One was loyalty to his wife Winnie, who, while was in prison, here's where her leadership wavered. She resorted to conspire to kidnapping. She resorted to using torture in the name of fighting against apartheid. Mandela saw this and he divorced her because he did not believe in what she's doing was right. One thing that I observed in this film that was not talked much of was Mandela's religious faith. To be the leader he was, I believe he had to have a strong faith. The film stated Nelson was a believer in Christ, but did not want his faith to become political, which leads to how high Mandela's emotional intelligence was. Mandela knew that he had issues because if he was talking about his religion, he feared that speak would be used against, would take it off focus of what the issue was. And he did not want his faith to become political. He wanted politics to be strictly against the fight against racism. And lastly, I'd like to say that Mandela's compassionate heart was also one of his weaknesses. And the African regime used that against Mandela to imprison him. They knew that Mandela would not waver from his moral character, his values and beliefs, and they used that to imprison him. Mandela's story taught me to be true to who I am and passionate about what I believe in. Also, I learned that leadership is doing what is right, even when it means great sacrifice. I'm going to end it with this. 3 questions I'd like for you to ponder on, and you can use these for responses. Was Mandela a freedom fighter, or was he a terrorist? And do you see similarities with Mandela's story with that of the United States when it became a country? 2. When it comes to team building and collaboration, does it appear that Mandela exemplified these leadership traits, or was there room for improvement? And the last question. Does Nelson Mandela's leadership story measure up to other great leaders such as Abraham Lincoln? That concludes my video. Thank you, and God bless.